Okay, good morning, everyone. We are on Tzadi Aleph Amud Aleph. Okay, we are moving forward. So we are going to have two brises that support two of the opinions that we just saw over the past few days. So Tanya Kavase de Rav. Okay, so we have a brise that supports the view of Rav. Okay, so if you recall, we had a machlokus between Rav and Shmuel that when there are adjoining roofs, when there are two roofs next to one another, they're flush side by side, right? So we had this case over here where, okay. Bottom line is you have two homes, right? Home one, home two, and they're separate homes, but they're all the roof is flush. It happens to be this one belongs to one person, this one belongs to another person. So Rav says you cannot carry over. Rav says that it's basically if they don't have an eruv, you can't carry between two places because at the end of the day, it's like no different than a courtyard which has two homes and they're open up into one another. If you don't have an eruv over here, you can't carry. Shmuel said you're allowed to carry. Why? Because he holds that this is going to be a imaginary wall, right? He holds that's good that basically this wall over here, even though it's not viewable, but it goes up, and these walls all go up, and so basically everyone is surrounded, everyone's surrounded by walls, and therefore, according to Shmuel, each person's allowed to carry within their own rooftop, right? That was the view of Rav. Okay, so we're going to bring a brisa to support this, and then Tanya Kavasid Rav Yehuda, and we're going to bring a support to Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda was the one who we saw yesterday who told us that according to Rav Shimon, the last view of our Mishnah, apparently there's more than one way to read it. We're not going to see the alternative way to read it today, but Rav Shimon is of the opinion they're allowed to go from a chatzar to a karpef to a rooftop. In other words, all those different places, which are all the different enclosed places, all the different rishus hayachid, you're allowed to go from one to the other, and that's the view of Rav Shimon. Whereas again, remember, Rameir and the Chachamim didn't allow the clear passage from one to another. Okay, so now we're going to bring the brisa. Tani Kavasi to Rav. Here's the brisa that supports the view of Rav. Kol gago seir. It's a long brisa, so bear with me. Kol gago seir rishus achasein. Okay, so this first viewer, as we're going to see, is Rameir. What we want to bring a support to for Rav is his view of the Chachamim. So first we're going to review Rameir. Rameir says, Kol gago seir rishus achasein. Rameir is of the opinion that all the roofs of a town are one domain. Remember, Rameir says, I'm allowed to go from one rooftop to another rooftop to another rooftop. That's what we discussed a little bit more yesterday. The asr lahalos lahorid. However, it is forbidden to go up or bring down min hagag lechatzer, from the roof to a chatzer, min hachatzer legagin, or from a chatzer to a roof. Why was that? What was the reason that it was forbidden to do that? And remember? The height, exactly, 10 tvachim, right? So again, Rameir said that when something is high or something is low, then you're not allowed to go from a roof to a courtyard to a roof. That was the view of Rameir. The kalim sheshavsu bechatzer mutter l'taltalan bechatzer. Utensils which began Shabbos in the courtyard are allowed to be carried in the courtyard. Okay, even though the houses don't join an eruv. So according to Rameir, what you have over here is, let's say you have these two houses. They did not make an eruv, so you can't carry. You certainly are not allowed to carry from one house to another. But let's say they left a baseball, a little ball over here, not to scale over here. So the kids or whatever adult, they could go ahead and play ball because the ball started out in the courtyard. You would not be allowed to bring it from the home into the courtyard because that's again like two distinct. Remember this we spoke about yesterday. If you go from a home, which is like a full-fledged private domain, into the courtyard, that already you're not going to be allowed to do according to Mayor. But if it starts Shabbos in the courtyard, you're allowed to keep it you're allowed to move it around in the courtyard. Okay, so let's go further. The gagin, if let's say you had the ball or whatever, something on a rooftop, you'd be allowed to carry it on the rooftop from one roof to another. Again, as long as one roof is not 10 tvachim high or 10 tvachim lower than the other, because of what we spoke about yesterday, that there's this concern of basically placing something, it could be confused with a case where a person is in the public domain and places something on a high item, an item which is 10 tvachim high and 4 tvachim wide. That would be actually going from a public domain to a private domain. Okay? Yes?
Why is it particularly detail about the ball being left out there?
Because if it's not left out there, then you would not be allowed to carry it. Meaning if it started Shabbos inside a home...
But it's considered to be one that you're allowed to carry. Why are you allowed to carry?
There's no eruv over here, right? Meaning there's no eruv in this case. And so the only way meaning there's a classic case where Chazal came along and said you need to make an eruv between homes. Okay? Rameir comes along and says, yes, when the Chacham said you need to make an eruv between homes in the courtyard, that's only so you could carry items from one home to another. But if something was left in a courtyard before Shabbos began, then even though that courtyard is an area which is owned by a bunch of people which did not make an eruv, at the end of the day though, since it started outside, it's not moving from one specifically, separate domain to another, therefore you're allowed to carry within that.
Never bring it back in.
Correct. It's only allowed to stay outside. Okay, good. Fine. Those are the words of Rameir. Each roof is a domain onto its own. Each roof is domain unto its own, and therefore you're only allowed to carry within 4 amos. You're only allowed to carry within 4 amos, right? So this brisa says explicitly that each roof is a domain unto its own, and yet, right, and you're only allowed to carry within 4 amos, right? Which is exactly what Rav said. Shmuel said, yeah, it's a domain unto its own, but this wall is an actual wall. It's not just, it's an actual wall, and therefore, according to Shmuel, each roof is actually enclosed, and you're allowed to carry fully. Rav says this wall is not a wall, and yet it's a domain unto its own, and therefore you're only allowed to carry within 4 amos, which is exactly Rav's opinion, right? Rav, again, one more time. Rav and Shmuel argued about this case when you have 2 adjacent rooftops. Rav Meir said you're allowed to carry freely between them. Fine. The Chum said you're not allowed to carry freely between them. The question is, what are you allowed to do within your own rooftop? Shmuel said you're allowed to carry freely within your own rooftop. Why? Because there's 1 wall, 2 walls, 3 walls, and this is a wall. Rav said this is not a wall. You can't see this wall, and therefore it's not a wall. And therefore Rav says, according to the Chachamim, since these 2 places open up one to another, there's no Eruv over here, and therefore the Chachamim would say you're not allowed to carry freely. You can only carry within 4 amos, and that's exactly what this brisa says. Yeah? Yes.
So what does this go with, like the pavilion? Yes. Does this have any?
So it's different.
Yesterday.
It's different in the sense that over here, this is as opposed to the pavilion, which has a rooftop and has 4 walls. Over here, the 4th wall there is no 4th wall according to Rab, because it's 2 rooftops which are side by side, flush side by side, and this wall, since it cannot be seen as a distinct space, therefore that wall does not virtually go up. Whereas if it's a regular rooftop or a pavilion, same thing, you would have 4 walls around it, and Rav would say no problem. According to the Chacham, you'd say no problem, you could carry fully on top of it. Over here, since it's 2 rooftops flush, one of the walls is missing, at least according to Rav's interpretation. Okay, Tani Kavas Rav Yehuda, and now we have a brisa that supports Rav Yehuda's understanding of Shimon, who says you're allowed to go from a roof to a chatzor to a karpef. Amar Rebbe said a story. When we were studying Torah under Rav Shimon in the city of Tekoa, Hayinu malin shemen valuntis migag legag. We would carry oil and towels from rooftop to rooftop, umigag lechatzor, and from a roof to a courtyard, umichatz lechatzor, from a courtyard to a courtyard, umichatz lekarpef, from a courtyard to a karpef, umikarpef lekarpef acher, and from one karpef to another, until we reach the spring in which we would bathe. In other words, he says on Shabbos they wanted to bathe in the spring. Now, either the spring. Now, bear in mind that now that at some point there was a decree that came along that we don't even bathe in full cold water. But in the times of the Gemara, they would bathe in cold water. At least in earlier times of the Gemara, they would bathe in cold water, and therefore they wanted to bathe on Shabbos. So either it was cold water or it was a natural hot spring. If it's natural hot spring, you'd also be allowed to bathe on it on Shabbos again prior to the decree that we don't bathe. We don't bathe on any of these things. We don't fully immerse ourselves in water in anything, unless it's for a mitzvah, but we wouldn't fully immerse ourselves, or if a person's really uncomfortable, like we spoke about, where Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva, you're allowed to shower in cold water if you're very, very uncomfortable. But the bottom line is, this was at a time when it was permitted to go ahead and bathe, and they wanted to bring their oils, which was their shampoo or soap, whatever, and they wanted to bring towels they could get out of the shower. The problem is that they're all living in homes, there are public domains. How do they do so? So Rav Shimon, so basically Rebbe says what they did is they took the oil and towels from the rooftop, then went to the next rooftop, then went to a carpet, then went to a courtyard, then went to a rooftop, whatever, and basically followed this whole long, elongated way to the beachfront, to the well, to the spring. And basically, what you see clearly is you are allowed to carry from a courtyard to a carpet to a rooftop, etc., and it's all seen as one domain. And this was specifically in the world of Rav Shimon. Okay, fine. So that supports Rav Yehuda's understanding of Rav Shimon that that's Rav Shimon allowed. Amar Rav Yehuda, the brisa continues and says that Rav Yehuda said, "Ma'isa b'shas sakana." It once happened during the time when it was prohibited to learn Torah. Okay, so there were times in Jewish history where it was prohibited to learn Torah, and it was Shabbos, and they wanted to read from the Torah. So what did they do? They couldn't bring it in a public space. So, malin sefer Torah mechatz legag, megag lechatz, mechatz lekarpef likros. And what they did is they took the Torah from a courtyard to a roof, to a rooftop to a courtyard, from a courtyard to a karpef, and then they read it. So you see, Rav Yehuda says that my view is correct, that Rav Shimon, this is the view of Rav Shimon, that clearly a person is allowed to go from one of those, that Rav Shimon's view is that you're not, as opposed to a mayor and the Chachamim would say you're allowed to go from courtyard to courtyard, or karpef to karpef, etc. Rav Shimon allows going to any of those together. Amrulo, the Chacham said back to him, Ein shas sakana raya. You can't bring a proof from a time of danger. That's not a proof. In other words, how can you bring a proof? The fact that you're specifically living during these perilous times, yeah, of course they did certain things which may have been lenient, but you can't go ahead and bring a proof to that because at the end of the day, that might be unique to a time of danger. Okay? End of discussion. Now we're going to go a little bit further into Rav Shimon's view. Again, one more time about Rav Shimon's view, so we can appreciate the next Gemara. Rav Shimon holds that a person is allowed to go from a courtyard to a rooftop to a karpef and back and forth. All those places are enclosed places, and then as opposed to a mayor and the Chacham say say, much more limited in terms of where you could go. Rav Shimon says all those places, as long as a person's not going, there's one exception. A person cannot go, take something from their home and bring it into your courtyard and then bring it around. What you are allowed to do, though, is go from your courtyard to, if this ball is in the courtyard, you could go then to a rooftop over here. There's a rooftop, and then you go to a carpet, but you can go all those and go around, and that's all fine according to Rav Shimon. What you cannot do is bring it from your home into this space. Now there's going to be a machlokas about the parameters of this halacha of Rav Shimon. Okay, so says the Gemara, Amar Rav Shimon Omer Echad Gagan, etc. Amar Rav Halacha Rav Shimon. Rav says the halacha follows Rav Shimon. This view that you are allowed to go from chatzar to karpef to rooftop. However, v'hushlo ervu. That's as long as they did not make an eruv. As long as there was no eruv made, right? This seems a little counterintuitive. Why? Aval ervu lo. But if they made an eruv, you can't do this. Why? Because had they made an eruv, then there's a concern. Meaning, Rav Shimon agrees you are not allowed to take something from here and then start doing this whole thing. It's only if the item started over here. Okay, so says Rav, if they made an eruv, there's a concern. Once there's an eruv, then these people, I'm allowed to take this little ball. I don't know if you can see it from all the way in the back, but you can take this ball and bring it into the courtyard, right? And then what's going to happen is you're going to start to, I can take this thing and I bring it up. Asur can't do that, right? So it's only if they did not make an eruv, and therefore there's no concern that there's items being taken from the home into the courtyard. It only is going to start over here on Shabbos. No problem. This is all going to be okay because there's no eruv made. Right? However, Shmuel disagrees. Shmuel Amar, Bein Ervu, Bein Shlo Ervu, whether an Ervu is made or not, then it's allowed. Rav Yochanan also said, in response to Rav, who said it's only when they did not make an Eruv, Mi Lechashcha, who whispered this enactment, this decree to you. In other words, where are you making up this stringency? He says, rather, Bein Ervu, Bein Shlo Ervu, like Shmuel, Rav Yochanan says, whether an Eruv is made or not, an Eruv is not made, you're allowed to carry items. They're not concerned. Ask the Gemara, Maskler. Maskler Chista, L'Shmuel Rav Yochanan, ask Max and Rav Chista, 9183, Yomru Shnei Kelim Bechatzar Achaz, Zamotar V'Zeh Aser. It's going to get confusing. You're going to have two items in one courtyard. One of them is going to be, you're allowed to move, right? This exact case, right? This ball over here, I don't have a better product than a ball, whatever it is. This piece of chal over here, you're going to be able to move around with. This one, this one you can't, and this one you could. It's beyond confusing, right? That's your question, Max, right? So the Gemara doesn't fully answer it, but shows that Rav Shimon, shows definitively that Rav Shimon doesn't have this concern. Why? Because, the second paragraph, Rav Shimon l'tameh. This is consistent with Rav Shimon Lo Gazer, who does not make this decree. Why? It's not we learned in the Mishnah way back, about 45 blot ago. Rav Shimon said, L'maha davar domeh, to what is this tchum law comparable to? L'shalosh chatzeros upsuchos zo lezo. You have three courtyards which are open to one another. Upsuchos rishus harabim, and they're all open to the public domain. I'm going to make a picture in a second. The erva, I know you're also excited. The erva shtei achitzonos imam mitzayis, and the two outer ones join in erva the middle chatzer. He muteres. Imahen, he is allowed to move things with them. They mutaras ima, and they can move things with him. But the two outer ones are prohibited with one another. So what's the case? The case is like this. Basically, you have you have three courtyards side by side. Okay, and they all are open to the public domain. Okay, and they make eruvs. These two people, these made eruvs. Okay, they made eruv. Okay, but they did not make eruvs with one another. Okay, so Chachamim said no one's allowed to carry. No one's allowed to carry. It's too confusing. And Rav Shimon said, no, this guy's allowed to carry things with this guy back and forth. The people in the middle allowed to carry these guys back and forth. But what's going to happen? What's going to happen is these people are going to bring their baseball into this courtyard. And then these people are going to bring their baseball into this courtyard. These people are allowed to use this baseball. They're not allowed to use this baseball. These people are allowed to use this baseball. They're not allowed to use this baseball. Okay? Bottom line is, it's the same exact case where you have two items in one courtyard, and it's confusing. These people are allowed to only use some of the items in this courtyard. These people only use some of the items in the courtyard, but not the others. It's literally the same case where you have this scenario where there are two baseballs, there are two things in this courtyard, and one of them can be used, one of them can't be used. And we see Rav Shimon explicitly, again, we're talking about a view within Rav Shimon. And Rav Shimon says, this is allowed, and no one's debating that. So Shmuel and Rav Yochanan say, okay, good question, Max, but the bottom line is, I could prove to you that Rav Shimon is not concerned about this. I don't know why, but that's not a question anymore. In other words, the Amoram were arguing, what did Rav Shimon say? Okay? So the Rav says a logical argument. Shmuel says something which we're pointing out is tricky, but at the end of the day, Shmuel says, okay, fair question, but I could prove to you that Rav Shimon is not concerned about that from this case.
How is it that, because they might have brought one item into
They both bring items, exactly the same case. They both bring items. This item can only go this way. It cannot go that way. This item can only go this way, cannot go that way.
It's a little bit different because in the case we have on the bottom, that was out before Shabbos started, and these are both being moved, who knows?
Over here also, you're going to have, in the middle of Shabbos, you're going to walk into the courtyard. Both cases, I walk into the courtyard, there are two balls over here. One ball can't go anywhere, and one ball can. Walk in the middle of Shabbos, one ball can go over here, one ball can't. More or less the same thing. Okay, so Gemara says, to finish the line, sorry?
But the person in the middle can stay out there the whole time and just keep throwing the ball.
Theoretically, the person taking the things out, but the point...
But you don't want to
Over here too, one person can walk outside at their house and say this ball, one person can stand there and say this ball can only be moved. Could be. Both cases you have that application.
Right, but that the person in the middle can he switch the ball?
No. The ball started in one courtyard. Yeah. Okay, so okay, so again, the one in the middle is allowed to use permitted with the outer courtyards. And they, the residents, the outer courtyards, are permitted to carry from their house into the middle courtyard. And the two outer courtyards are prohibited with one another. And we don't worry that one person may carry utensils that started in one outer courtyard into another outer courtyard. Here too, same thing. We're not going to be concerned that a person may carry utensils which start in a house into an adjoining chutzner. And therefore, again, Rav Yochanan and Shmuel support their view, just saying that Rav Shimon, again, not answering the question, but saying clearly Rav Shimon does not have this concern. Okay, the Gemara asks now a question on Rav's understanding. Okay, Rav was the one who said that it's only when they did not make an Eruv, right? But when they made an Eruv, it's not going to work. When they made an Eruv, it's not going to work. Ask the Gemara. Master Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes asks from our Mishnah. Rav Shimon Omer, Echad Gagos, Echad Chatzeros, Echad Karpefos, whether it's a roof, a courtyard, or a karpef, Rishos Achasein Lekelim Sheshavsu B'Sochan, okay, it is one domain regarding utensils that began Shabbos in any of these areas. Again, if the baseball began Shabbos on a roof, on a courtyard, or karpef, you're allowed to move them all to all the other ones. V'lo lekelim sheshavsu b'soch, but it is not one domain for utensils that began Shabbos in the house. Okay, so that's what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says it is one domain for items which started in the courtyard, but it is not one domain for items which started in the house. Ask the Gemara. Asks Rav Sheshes. If you want to say that we're talking about a case where they made an eruv, then you could find a legitimate way where the utensils started in the house and they're now in the courtyard. Again, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said, according to Rav Shimon, you're only allowed to move the baseball that started in the courtyard. You're not allowed to move the baseball that started in the house. Wait a second. How did the baseball in the house get to the courtyard? If you made an eruv, it makes a lot of sense that it ended up that a ball from the house ended up in the courtyard. You took it justifiably from the house into the courtyard. That makes a lot of sense, right? Which is exactly what Shmuel and Rav Yochanan say. That Rav Shimon's case is even in a case where you made an eruv. So now we understand why the Mishnah says if the ball started in the house, then you can't move it from the courtyard into the other places. Okay, but you have a reason, you have a understandable, you have a legitimate pathway for the ball to start in the house to end up in the courtyard. Now we have to say, that ball in the courtyard can't be moved because it started in the house. But that's because must have been there must have been an Eruv. Eliyar must be shlo Eruv. But if you want to say, like Rav says, that Rav Shimon only allows this case in the case where there's no Eruv, how do you have a case where a ball started in the house and ended up in the courtyard? Doesn't make sense. So the Gemara says, "Who most of love, whom Rav Shish asked the question, and he answers the question. B'chumta v'sudra. We're talking about a piece of clothing, literally a cap or a scarf. In other words, you're not allowed to carry items on Shabbos. But for all of you who finished on Masechah Shabbos, what do you know? You know that I'm allowed to walk outside of my house wearing clothing. Obviously, that's not called carrying, right? And let's say I'm standing in my courtyard and I say, "Oh my gosh, it's actually quite warm outside. I thought it was cold because 10 minutes ago I was living in Baltimore and it was cold, and now 10 minutes later it's boiling hot. So I take my scarf off and I put it down. I'm allowed to do that. That's not carrying, right? Or I was wearing a hat and I say, I don't need to wear this hat. I put it down, right? All those cases would be legitimate pathways for my item to start off in my house and to end up in the courtyard, even if there was no Eruv. Even if those are Eruv, I'm allowed to put it down in the courtyard, just leave it there, right? Because I didn't carry it out. Meaning what I'm not allowed to do is take this marker, which assuming it's not muksa, and bring it from my house to the outside. Or like carry a cap and bring it from inside to outside. But if I was wearing something, I never carried it out. I was wearing it. And then when I'm outside, I decide to put it down. That's the case that the Mishnah is talking about within Rav Shimon, who says I'm not allowed to carry something that started off in a house and start moving it all around. Therefore, there's no question on Rav. Yes?
Okay, this is just kind of related, but so like if we were in Denver and we're walking, we realize there's no air, but it gets really hot. So my daughter, I don't want, it's like expensive stuff, so I put it on me. Am I allowed to do that? So if I don't drop it and leave it, was I allowed to do that? Sorry.